executed for their part in the 1916 Rising. And today we have three fantastic historians and speakers to discuss their lives and ultimately their deaths. Speaking on behalf of poor Pearse, and this is the very house in which he was born. The very house he was born in Ionad. Big blue bus for Roon for coming around. And of course, Helen Litton speaking on behalf of Tom Clark, the mastermind behind the 1916 Rising. Again, another big blue bus for Helen. And finally, Shane Kennan is here to talk about Thomas McDonagh, a person who is one of the most influential members of the 1916 Rising. Big blue bus for Shane. People get on with speaking, so get out of your way. So the first to speak is a Roon.
Well, this is, I suppose this could be regarded as a very solemn occasion. It could be regarded as a joyous occasion, depending on one's long view. Speaking 100 years after Pearse, McDonagh and Clark were shot to death in the Stonebreakers Yard of Main Prison is never going to be something I could regard as an uplifting experience. Having said that, I'm deeply honoured to be here, and I thank the organisers for arranging this. It was actually very apposite and timely and correct that you've done this, my friend, because very often we do not look at the price paid for those who've struggled to make this country a better country for all of us, for our descendants, and for those who are yet to come. Pearse walked these boards. His family lived in this building. They plied their trade as, I suppose, an upper middle income style family in an area that was often quite poor. As I pointed out, and I'm not the first, I won't be, hopefully not the last, they lived within the sights and the sounds of dreadful tenements, which were negative but evocative legacies of everything that's wrong with imperialism. Everything that's wrong with a country that has no national government, a bit like ourselves these days. It cannot continue. We were in the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Ireland, within the British Empire, or the Empire simply, shorthand for many of those who grew up in this country. We were doing things, dreadful things were done in our name across the globe, in more than 180 countries. I would be the first to acknowledge that my own family were amongst those in the Dublin Fusiliers and other regiments of the Imperial forces who were doing it. So it's a complicated, contested, difficult narrative that has very significant types of social and history that revisionist historians don't want to deal with, but it's meant to be their thing. It has the top level sort of parliamentary history that people don't want to interpret correctly, and to trickle down to what matters to people on the ground in this city, in this country, in these islands, which are rarely actually contested. Now, I haven't got long to speak tonight. There's a lot I could say, but I do feel we should mark this occasion in terms of those who paid the ultimate price for believing in democracy, in progressive politics, in pluralism, in secularism. Now, Pearse would have been one of the most Christian devout people of those who was executed, but he's a man in the Fenian tradition who believed that there's an appropriate relationship between the church and state, that there's nothing inherently wrong with organised religion, and I think most people would probably accept that, and many would not. But in those days, that was not a complicated position. You were allowed to be a devout Christian, you were allowed to be a devout Catholic, devout Methodist, devout Presbyterian. That was fine. The argument of the United Irishman from 1791 was that the issues of Protestant Catholic dissenter should not be exploited to justify political exclusion of any single element, and indeed the persecution of those who were not aligned with the establishment, which was sectarian, imperialist, doctrinaire, remote, and as the 1916 proclamation averred, alien. Now, the The British are not alien to us. We have bonds of shared history that are profound. I don't imagine as many people here don't have someone belonging to you who has or is domiciled in the United Kingdom. However, insofar as their imperial route ran in this country, people of the generation that went out to fight in 1916 have survived the calamity of Angorta Moor in 1845 and 1850. By 1900, 1905, 1910, when Pearse was a young man becoming into his own blood, he would have realised that his parents were survivors, his grandparents were survivors, that the bulk of the Irish population had been destroyed in this country by death and exclusion, by banishment, by refugee status across the globe. If you look at a base population of at least 8.5 million in 1845, and by the early 1910s it dipped below 4 million, something disastrous on the level of the Black Death has befallen our people. Could that be related to the fact that there is no elected parliament of any description in College Green or anywhere else in Dublin Castle prior to that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's not kid ourselves here. If they did not set out to kill us, they did a very good job of doing so. Half our population evaporated. 1.2 million dead in the ground in burial pits, in Gross Eel, in the Atlantic, on the dunes of Clare. Now that's not to say that that generation felt that they wanted reparations, that they wanted a pound of flesh for what had befallen them. But suffice to say, if they required any motivation to bring Republican democracy to this country, it was not lacking. When Pearse walked from this house to Western Row to go to Christian Brothers, where he received an excellent education, he would have passed people in dire poverty, who did not look like he was, were not dressed as he was, did not have their photographs taken in their finery on outings, did not come from relative comfort, having struggled for it, with an English radical father and a radical Irish mother, whose background went straight back 1867, 1848, 1798 and before. The rising in every generation concept beloved by Pearse and Connolly was not theoretical for either Pearse or Connolly. They knew exactly what that meant and why it remained relevant. Because any people who've undergone an existential threat understand that if you don't struggle for your liberty, they will kill you. You won't just be neglected, marginalised, demonised, your culture satirised, your language and your culture disenfranchised, ridiculed, the faith of 80% of the population, regardless of how anyone feels about that, subject to penal laws, in a country where even the nonconformist Protestant tradition were also penalised until 1 year before Catholic emancipation in 1829. These are things that impact on your everyday sense of going about your business as a person. The London was telling us that we were subjects of their dominion, that we could not aspire to democracy, that we were not citizens, that we were basically an unloved element of their empire. And this is why, when I listen to some of the calumny levelled against men like Pearse, Clark, MacDonagh and the others, and many who are not famous, whose names are barely recorded. I see my very good friend and comrade, Lord Collins, down here, has done a tremendous job of helping document exactly who did what when. Suffice to say, when we consider what they were attempting to do, I say, personally, as an Irish citizen of an imperfect republic, that it was infinitely more progressive, valid, required than anything that was done against them. When I hear some of the lies spoken about Pearse, it makes my blood boil. Because I have to be straight about this, and again, I may be a little bit intemperate on this point. The people who are making these points, certain allegations about the character of Pearse and his objectives, are liars. They're not just wrong, they are lying to us. This is a canard. It is deliberate, organised, sustained, protected by certain values, protected by certain codes, protected by certain modes of broadcast, which are more attributable to a wartime situation than any natural country seeking to find itself in the Western world. They're lying to you. The demonstrable nonsense and the imagined bullshit of this shower of cretins has been allowed to go unchecked. New lies are entering the fold. And there's one minor point I'd like you to bear in mind before I stop talking to you, and I could for many hours, and would give it half a chance. It is this. I recently had the pleasure of debating live on air a significant biographer of Patrick Pearse, who wrote a very interesting and important book some decades ago. And that book, in many respects, remains valid, important, a step forward. But the historian in question was mentioning a new lie, a new canard, which is trying to blame Patrick Pearse specifically for the execution of his comrades. Now, I'll tell you something, I didn't see that coming. Call me naive. I've seen a lot of things in my 47 years. The age that Connolly was shot to death in the Stonebreaker's Yard. I never thought I would hear this nonsense. I do my best to remain cool here. Suffice to say, it is demonstrably, factually untrue. The definition of aid to the enemy, which Pearse appeared to fulfill, was also satisfied by anyone observed to be in arms, either on active service or in the act of surrender. So the entirety of the relocated headquarters garrison from the GPO that fought in the breakout to Moore Street, the entire terrace, and eventually, after consultation of the surviving members of the upper leadership, which was largely intact, decided to preserve the lives of civilians who were being shelled to death and machine gunned to death and sniped to death by the British at close range from a Parnell Street barricade, from persons located on the top of the Rotunda Hospital, from persons located here in the tower of Tower Street Fire Station, right here, shooting men, women and children. That when that decision was made, it was with a view to accepting that they'd gone as far as they could within their own terms of reference. The declaration of the Irish Republic had been made on the 24th of April 1916. The Republic had been made real, no longer virtual, in the concept of the Fenians, and they were mostly Fenians in one way or another, sometimes literally, made real by the resistance of 6 days at a time when they'd hoped they'd hold out for 2 or 3. That they'd done enough, and it was immoral, perhaps, arrogant and ethical, to continue a struggle that would not achieve military victory when the political point had been made. This is a mature decision. Clark was against it, and I'll defer to my good friend Helen to discuss this further, if she wishes to. Clark and Pearse were in favour of a final effort, another breakout. Eventually they were persuaded otherwise. McDermott was in tears. Important second-level commanders were conflicted over this. Dermot Lynch helped restore order. The point being, this is not some forlorn effort for nothing. It was propaganda of the deed on a giant scale to give meaningful effect to the progressive ideals of the 1916 proclamation, which they had achieved. And when people like Pearse withdrew, they obviously had to deal with the fact that they're all likely to be executed. The villain of the piece, historically, in Irish dialogue, is General Sir John Maxwell. Now, as the man Percy tasked by Asquith with restoring order, with plenary powers, as we call it literally, he knew he could get away with a good deal. And if you want a counter-proof of that, ask yourselves this. Who was ever held to account for the mass murder in cold blood of the North King Street residents? Okay? Let's put that out there. I'm not saying we need a Savile tribunal. And if we have a tribunal, I don't want to be Savile, let alone Widgery. Suffice it to say that if there is any form of due process in this, retrospectively current or otherwise, we haven't seen it. So they're going to get those they wanted to get. The question is how many. The point of law is that a very ordinary term, it's a bit like this Fisher Secrets Act. everyone in this room, the rest of this country, is bound by the Official Secrets Act. You do not have to sign it to be subject to it. If you sign it, they're basically saying we'll throw the book at you if you talk out of class. Of course they've been aiding the enemy. But as I said to you, possessing a weapon, either in action or the time of surrender, with the whole Moorsley garrison had done, pile them up on the way to the Rotunda and into the Rotunda Gardens, in sight of numerous British Army officers who were their enemy, it was quite clear that they had been aiding the enemy. The new lie is that this was Pearse's fault for mentioning a letter to his mother that he expected assistance from Germany. Alright, I'm not going to be pedantic here, unlike my protagonist, but let's put it this way. The enemy aided us in attempting to provide firearms to create a democratic republic. We did not aid Imperial Germany in any way, other than perhaps, satisfying some form of confusion amongst the ranks of their opponents. The British wanted to fight that war. Then they found they couldn't win it, and ultimately they didn't win it. You had the armistice on the 11th of November 1918, and I look forward to that anniversary for some serious and honest discussion. I won't hold my breath. Then you have the travesty of 1919, 1920, which rejected us into the Second World War. So thank you very much, Phiarsaigh. Thank you very much for the catastrophe of the Second World War after the dismal disgrace of the First. Pearse was highly conscious of what he was doing. He had separately offered his own death as a quotient to Sir John Maxwell. And we know this because the most important figure in this thing is not, at that point, Pearse, and certainly not Maxwell. It's Sir Alfred Bucknell. Bucknell, also personally charged by Asquith with seeing to the legal affairs, was the man who decided what type of law would be applied and how it would be applied. Let's put it this way. If anyone tells you, and they will, on radio and television documentaries, that Pearse's acknowledgement of any form of contact with Germany was the precedent for the execution of anyone else, they are factually wrong. And when you go home tonight, and hopefully before you go home tonight, check out the BMH, look for Bucknell and see what he says. Bucknell was the most important counterinsurgent in Ireland in 1916, not Maxwell. It was Bucknell who corralled Maxwell, instructed him in law, and decided what was admissible and how these things would be operated. So in conclusion, because I want to give enough time to my good friend Shane and of course my good friend Helen, I will say this. Is it not instructive? Here we are 100 years after those men were shot, that there is still an attempt to form new lies about their motivation, about their activities. Is this not sinister? That it flies in the face of obvious basic level scholarship, of common sense, of rationality, of reasonable extrapolation from the most traditional and important of all building blocks of cultural assessment, facts. Is it not incredible that some of the most privileged and appointed persons are given leeway to tell us new lies? They fear the legacy of those executed in 1916 because it is unambiguous. It is irrefutable in terms of its content and its context. They wanted an Ireland of equals, an Ireland that was non-sectarian, that was pluralist, where women would have the vote. Can you believe that? Where women would have the vote, where all men would have the vote, and we would determine on a democratic basis a version of ourselves in government that would act on our behalf collectively, constrained by a constitution. This is not something that London wanted then or now. Now that is their prerogative. If they don't want our friends in London, if they do not want a Bill of Rights and a happy House of Lords and a no written constitution, that's their business. In their country, we must abide by their social mores and customs. But they will not tell us what to do. I won't stand for it as an historian. I'm only a single Irish historian, a single Irish citizen. Won't stand for it. Not in my name. I aver that Patrick Pearse was a hero. I aver that he was a patriot. The extent to which he is a martyr is because they shot him. He's prepared to die, and let's not be sentimental about it. He's prepared to kill to do this, but not in an indiscriminate, terroristic, jihadic manner. In a way that was reasonable, rational, defined, and honourable. He was a man of integrity. Now, I may have all of this wrong, and if I do, I would look forward to any constructive debate with anyone who will tell me otherwise. But until I am so disabused of my opinion, it is based on a certain amount of research, that is what I hold. So I thank you for coming here tonight. We could not be in a better place at a better time. God bless Ireland.
I'd like to introduce Hannah Litton to speak about Tom Clark. Well, see, like I was looking for Shane getting the height for this.
If you leave me to the last one. That's better. I can see you. I'm the great niece of Kathleen Clark, who is Tom's wife. So I have a family interest in the matter, as well, of course, having written a biography of Tom in the 16 Lives series. Spoke to historian Desmond Ryan, who is a volunteer in the GPO. In a sense, Tom Clark is a man of one small book, a few letters, and his signature in the 1916 proclamation. And for many decades, that has been the way it has been seen, that Tom was a lesser known member of the leaders who hadn't maybe done all that much. He signed the proclamation, he wrote this book about his prison experiences. But nobody knew very much about him for quite a long time. And it's only in the last few years, a couple of decades of research, that become clear that Tom Clark was really one of the guiding forces behind the whole movement, along with Sean McDermott. But Tom was essentially a backroom man. That's how he liked it. He wished to stay in the background. He was never a public figure, never wanted to be. And he chose people like Pearse, who he knew were good public figures and could speak, and people would listen to them. Clark was born in England in 1858. This is a matter of slight discussion. Another biographer has asserted that, in fact, he was born a year earlier before his parents were married, because he cannot find, there is no birth certificate for 1858 in England, but he can't find anything in Tipperary either, so nobody is perfectly certain. Anyway, his father was a British soldier and his mother was from Tipperary, and he spent 6 years in South Africa with his family until they were sent back to Ireland. And James, the father, was appointed sergeant of the Ulster Militia. So Tom grew up essentially in Dungannon from the age of about 8 in County Tyrone. And it was here that he formed his political views. It's here that he observed the situation with Catholics. He could see the way sectarianism operated, and the difference between rich and poor. And he became born into the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Fenian group, in 1879. He was sworn in by John Daly of Limerick, who at that stage was the head centre of Connemara and was going around Ireland swearing people into the IRB. He didn't know then that John Daly would become closely linked to him in later years. He emigrated to the States in 1880, joined Clan na Gael, and became involved in the dynamite campaign, which was underway then. So in early 1883, having been trained in the use of explosives, he was sent to Britain. He was sent with several others. They were informed on. They were followed by detectives from the moment they landed. There was never any prospect that they would have got away with anything they wanted to do. Tom was arrested with nitroglycerine, which he seems to have treated extremely casually, carrying it around on a train. So I wonder just what sort of state of nitroglycerine it was actually. In those days, maybe it wasn't particularly well made, but it was probably completely lethal. He was tried at the Old Bailey in 1883 and sentenced to penal servitude for life for conspiracy to murder. He was aged 25. He The charges were in conspiring maliciously to destroy and damage financial history and other explosive essentials, with intent and for the purpose of enabling others to commit certain felonies, and also for conspiracy to murder. He chose to conduct his own offence and defended himself on the grounds that he had not actually committed any act as alleged, which is true, that he had not been proven to have committed such acts, and that intention to commit a crime did not in itself constitute a crime. However, this defence was not listened to, and in fact there had never been any doubt what the verdict was going to be. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, and he found himself in Chatham Prison, which is one of the toughest prisons in Britain, and he remained there for about 12 years. For the last 3 years of his sentence, he spent 15 years in prison altogether, the last 3 years in Portland, which was a slightly easier system. The system in Chatham was a silent system. Absolute silence was kept all the time. Any contact between prisoners was forbidden. You couldn't look at another prisoner or wink at them or smile at them or acknowledge their presence at all. And punishments ranged from solitary confinement or beating with a birch or whip. They were disturbed every hour at night to check them, so sleep became impossible, and there's a rather grisly list in the papers of Tom and Kathleen Clark, the National Library, which is a list of all the prisoners who went through that treatment, all of the other females at that time, and how many of them were released insane or lived for a very short time after they were. The aim was essentially to break them so that they would never commit a crime again. Tom later wrote an account of his prison years, Glimpses of an Irish Felon's Prison Life. He kept himself sane by endless calculations. He seems to have been of a mathematical turn of mind. So instead of trying to fight the system, he just went into his own head. He estimated the number of bolts in the doors, he counted the bricks in the wall, estimated how many bricks there were in that wall, how many bricks there were in the whole prison, how much hair was cut, he measured the amount of hair cut from his head every week, and how much would be cut every year. He just seems to have devoted himself to that kind of thing. He was imprisoned as Henry Hammond Wilson. This was the pseudonym he'd taken on when he started travelling from New York to Britain. And he was arrested and imprisoned as Henry Hammond Wilson, so that in fact about 2 years, 9 months after his imprisonment, his family suddenly realised where he was. They hadn't heard from him since he'd emigrated to New York, and a family friend saw a sketch of him in a newspaper and decided that looked like Tom Clark. He contacted his family. Later his sister Hannah was able to visit him, but of course in those days a visit from Ireland to London or to England was a matter of boats and trains and several days, exhausting and expensive. And you could go through all that to find when you arrived at the prison that the visit had been cancelled because the prisoner had contravened some regulation and you'd have to turn around and go back home again. In 1884, Tom Clark recognised John Daly coming into the prison. He'd equally been arrested for dynamite activities, and they formed a very strong friendship which over the years seems to have maintained their sanity. It meant a great deal to both of them, and they were able to communicate through a sort of system of Morse code, knocking on tin plates, knocking on the walls, and passing little notes under the noses of the prison guards. And I think in the end, Tom's hardest prison years were the 3 years he spent after Daly was released. Because Daly was released in 1896, and Tom was not released until 1898. And for that time, he was the only female prisoner in the prison, and was treated exactly the same as if he was one of a dozen. And it must have been incredibly lonely. He was released on licence, aged 40. And received a hero's welcome in Dublin, reunited with his mother and his sister. He never saw his father again. His father died before he was released. He was invited to Limerick by Daly, who had now become the first nationalist mayor of Limerick, and here he was welcomed by the entire Daly family. This consisted of John Daly, his sister-in-law's 8 daughters and 1 son, and his own sister and his mother. Now the third daughter was Kathleen, and Tom Clark became very interested in Kathleen, who was aged 21, and she and him. And they ultimately announced their engagement, much to the annoyance of her mother, who thought that Tom Clark didn't look like a good bet for anybody. He was aged by his imprisonment. He was 20 years older than she was, and didn't look as if he'd ever earned a decent living. He couldn't get work in Ireland. He went back to New York. Kathleen followed him. They were married in 1901, and they stayed in New York until 1907. Having their first son, named John Daly. They ran a market gardening farm in Long Island, but by 1907, Tom was aware that things were happening in Europe which might lead to a war. Now, he'd always been very angry when he was in prison that nobody, during the Boer War, nobody in Ireland tried to fight Britain at all. And he decided if there was an opportunity arising, he would not let it go. It took him quite a while to persuade Kathleen. Kathleen's memoir, Revolution Moon, woman which I was instrumental in getting published back in 1991. She wrote that in the 1940s. But it's clear from a memoir that those years in New York were really very happy years for her, being with her husband and her son on this farm. And it took a lot of persuading to get back to Ireland because she knew perfectly well what it would mean. But it was the end of that happy domestic life. By early 1908 they were back in Ireland, and Tom had established a newsagent back in his shop, one in Ameling Street, and he shortly afterwards opened one down in Barnell Street, just around the corner from O'Connell Street. And their second son Tom was born just early in 1908 as well. Now he